don't need this anymore, or do I?
That's for Sunday.
Okay.
This one's mine. So here is, this is for you. Pass that down.
I'm gonna fill it.
Yeah. Oh, it's a dog, thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah, I didn't understand.
I got inspired to,
Is this for us too?
this is for everybody else
Okay.
who's,
Same as what I've already got.
yeah. So I printed out a couple of different things. As I was preparing, I sort of, you know, there's a, I don't know if it's a joke or a story or both, with about a Supreme Court justice who was invited to speak, and he said, "How long am I meant to speak for at the engagement?" And the organizer said, you know, asked him, like, does it, you know, you're basically a professional orator, does it really make a difference? And he said, well, if it's for 2 hours, I don't have to prepare, but if it's for 20 minutes, I really have to prepare. So in that vein, I sort of last minute got all inspired to add all these other things. And actually, let me hang on to it just so I have a copy of the text too. So the stapled one is the text from Lessons in Tanya, and Lessons in Tanya is the standard go-to for beginning to study Tanya, right? It is.
Actually, I said like we didn't do like, you know, I mean, I know that Rabbi Ari was doing a Tanya class at his house, and, but I came after, but then we did lesson of that.
Yeah, so that's sort of like
one of the volume we studied. Yeah.
So Lessons in Tanya was put together by Rabbi Yosef Weinberg, who he probably passed away like it was 10 years ago, 10 or 11 years ago, and he came up with this idea to teach Tanya on the radio in Brooklyn. I mean, it was broadcast throughout New York City, and there was a channel that was like a radio station that was, I think it was an AM station that like was like, you know, like public access type of deal, and they would have a lot of Yiddish programming, and he would give a Yiddish Tanya class every week, and would write down all his notes and would submit it to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe edited and really annotated it very thoroughly. And actually on the last page of this is endnotes, and there's a whole long note 9 was written by the Rebbe. And this throughout the series, there's lots of different notes that different things the Rebbe added, and so it became, because of that, besides it just being a fantastic work, it became really the most authoritative and de facto commentary on the Tanya, and they've formatted it really nicely, so it's very accessible and it's free on Chabad.org. So I printed this out for the sort of the base of our conversation tonight, talking about chapter 32, Lamed Beis in Hebrew, right? 32 is if you spell it out in Gematria, Lamed is 30 and Beis is 2, and we actually know. So the tradition is that this chapter is the heart of Tanya, right? Lamed Beis Lev is heart, and so this chapter is seen as the heart of Tanya, and it's all about love. It's all about Ahavas Yisrael, all about the love that we have for our fellow Jews. And we actually know that that in the original manuscript that the Alter Rebbe wrote, this was not included. There's a first edition of Tanya that has been unearthed and was printed, or at least was prepared for print, and it went essentially from 31 to 33. there was a chapter 32, but the text of it was what we now know of as 31 to 33. And contextually, it's sort of out of left field. We're going to see how it's not. This extra page that I printed was from page 31. And we see in the first lines how he connects the two and why this was the place where it was relevant. But it was also relevant because the 32, the heart of Chassidus, is about what we do for each other, is the way we love each other. And this is an essential point that is important to make, which is, we spoke a lot last week about this idea of the long, short way, right? And the methodology of Tanya as being very intellectual and putting a great emphasis on meditation as how we sort of orient ourselves and elevate ourselves and identify to see ourselves as a soul and not a body, right? And when we come to a chapter like this, I think it would be easy for us to, if not dismiss, at least sort of relegate what is being suggested here as something that's intellectual or intellectualized. That the love that the Alter Rebbe is telling us about, that we have to have, that is a mitzvah, right? It says in the Torah, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha," you should love your fellow as yourself. And the tradition is that every morning when we begin davening, we say, it's a tradition from the Arizal, that we say, "Hareini mikabel alai," hereby accept upon myself the mitzvah of "V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha," and that it's fundamental and central to Hasidic thought. And what the Alter Rebbe really gets at here is not something that's automatic or disconnected or intellectualized, but that it's really what is trying to be accomplished here. What he's trying to convey to us here is that the love should be with vitality. It should be with real passion, and it should motivate us to go out of our way to be there for each other and to increase in good deeds and be extra considerate and kind and compassionate to each other. So it is not enough to just talk about it. It is not enough to theorize it, but that love and what it means to really integrate radical love and radical community, a recognition, like he mentions, of echad l'kulanu, that we have one source, we have one Father and one source, and that we are all siblings, we're all family, and we're all in this together, is something that, in as much as it's spoken about, the real place where we see it is in action. And this ties into the chapter before and the chapter afterwards, and we will address all that. Let's just see if I have any other notes. So in the beginning, in this italicized text, we have first, this is from the Lessons in Tanya, and he is addressing, he's sort of connecting the dots between chapter 31 and where we are now in chapter 32. And so on this supplemental page, I printed out chapter 31 we'll be looking at in a week or two. Chapter 31 opens the conversation about joy and the importance of joy as the foundation of our service, of our relationship with God, and first addresses the ways in which a person could experience depression or bitterness. And those are two distinct experiences in the view of the Alter Rebbe, in the view of the Tanya. And they have very different experiences, where depression is immobilizing, bitterness can lead to action, or a sense of contriteness, I'm not sure. Contrition, bingo. That was embarrassing. So he starts off talking about this, that when a person reflects on what they're made of and who they are and how they've gotten to the point where they are today, there can be a lot of feelings that present as negative feelings, and learning how to navigate them is something that the Alter Rebbe in a lot of ways sort of discourages, because they're so nuanced and they can be so difficult and such a trap, and we can lose ourselves in them often. He prescribes certain systems and certain things to do in various circumstances, but for the most part, it is advised against. But then he sort of shifts about 2/3 of the way through the chapter, and he starts talking about how a person can speak to himself and how a person can frame his existence to feel more positive, to reframe and to re-identify in accord with what we were saying last week. And so he has all of these quotes where he speaks in the first person of how a person ought to talk to himself. This is in this one that says chapter 31. So the first thing he says is that a person has to say to himself, "Indeed, without a doubt, I am far removed, utterly remote from God, and despicable, contemptible, and so on. But all of this is true only of me, that is, my body and the animating soul within it, the nefesh bahamis, the animal soul. Yet within me there is a veritable part of God," right? Like we said in chapter 2 last week, a chelik elikam imal mamish, an actual piece of God that is the divine soul, which is present even in the most worthless of my fellows, so that even I am no better than he. I still have this part of God within me, namely the divine soul and the spark of godliness itself clothed in it, animating it. I will make my entire aim and desire to extricate it from this exile and return it, quote, to her father's house, i.e. to restore it to its source and to its original state as in her youth. So when we're talking about the soul, there's a lot of intense things that he says here that seem to pass judgment, but I think really what he's saying, what he's emphasizing to say in the most worthless of my fellows, so to speak, is we can so often justify our actions where when we see somebody else do it, it's so offensive and it can be so abhorrent. But for us, we justify it, right? We can justify it, we can legitimize our own actions and say, well, there's extenuating circumstances and there's a whole background to it, and there's so much more to the story that we don't always afford to our neighbor, to our friends. And so I think the Alter Rebbe is really speaking to our experience of that. Not that he's actually passing judgment in this, not that we pass judgment, but that to speak to that experience where we might afford ourselves all this extra consideration and not to somebody else. So in that recognition that we're not affording it to somebody else and that we're really judging them harshly, we still recognize that the essential, the fundamental fact of existence is that everybody has a divine soul, and that divine soul is a great equator in some ways, right? It levels the playing field, that we are all equal and we are all connected and we are all on the same level playing ground, in that we are all sourced in divinity, we are sourced in God's singularity. And so we can talk to ourselves and use that as a way to reorient our perspective, because the more we're able to, the way that we sort of naturally work, right, is that being that we can afford ourselves more consideration, being that we can go easier on ourselves, it's easy for us, though it can be dangerous, to identify that there is something godly about us, right? It's easy for me to look at myself and say, well, yeah, I do have a divine soul, right? We know ourselves better. We're in our heads. We experience. Whereas people can just present as, unidimensional, as supporting actors in the play that is our life. And this is really this begins by saying, the same way that we can learn to re-identify our own existence and see the divinity inside of us, we have to extend that consideration outwards. And I have to be proactive to say that I'm going to choose to see the godliness within every person, and I'm going to look past the physicality of each person.
I can't help but be surprised by his use of the feminine here in the last sentence.
Yeah.
Is that identifying a particular aspect of God? Like I sometimes hear, what is it, Shekhinah?
The Shekhinah, yeah. So this is talking about the soul, right? The soul is feminine. The soul is, in this sense, is feminine. There is definitely, it talks about in Kabbalah there being masculine and feminine souls. The Mizutra Maggid, the Alter Rebbe's teacher, talks a lot about everybody has to learn how to embrace the feminine. In the classical breakdown that Kabbalah really embraces the male-female dynamic, the male-female dichotomy. So that mirrors and parallels the mashpia makabel, the giver-receiver type of dichotomy as well. So learning how to embrace our feminine side is learning how to be that receiver in the relationship that we have with God. Right? That's where we get this idea. You hear oftentimes people will say something to the effect of like, in Kabbalah it says that women are holier, right? You ever heard somebody say that? It's a thing that goes around from time to time. And it's not like it says in Kabbalah like women are holier, that's not like a line in Kabbalah anywhere. But what it does talk about is that in this dichotomy, the experience that we have as men is that we are both a mashpia, we are the giver, and physiologically and anatomically, and also typically in the way relationships are set up. But at the same time, we're a receiver, right? We're a receiver from God. So women are more settled in their receiver type of role, and so because of that, they're sort of naturally more aligned. That's why the entire concept of time-bound mitzvahs only applies to men, because we're the ones who need the constant reorientation and inundation, whereas women are sort of naturally more programmed, they're more aligned in that state.
That's when I usually hear they're more holy in
Right,
that context.
right, right.
Can it be, so what was the original language? Time.
If I can find it right here.
No, but what's the language here?
Oh, it's in Hebrew.
Oh, you go.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe it come also from, like I know in French, that's like the feminine and masculine, and I tend to,
Right.
hopefully I don't do this anymore after 20 years, but here, I used to say the table, she,
Right.
because
Right.
French.
Yeah, so Hebrew works the same way.
The soul,
Yeah. Right.
the-
Right. The Hebrew works the same way, but where is it? But he says Lachayesa rak shehi b'chinas galus, but that he, meaning that she, is in a state of exile, referring to our divine soul. And so there is something feminine about the soul. It's not, everything in the Hebrew language is exact, and so in that sense, the fact that the word neshama is a feminine word. Could I trouble you to get the door?
Oh, sure.
Hey, Dwayne. Oop. So, yeah. So Hebrew is also Hebrew has that gender difference as well. Sorry about that. How you doing? Okay. So so there is a feminine aspect to the soul, which is there was actually just recently I saw something that the Maggid was talking about as well. So we are in chapter 32 in Tanya, and 32 is the numerical value, or the letters spell out the word lev, which means heart. And this chapter is all about love, about the love we have for our fellows. As the Torah tells us, "V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha," You shall love your fellow as yourself. And so this chapter, as the heart of Tanya, is devoted entirely to that. So with that, as this supplementary page talks about all the different ways we can inculcate in our perception to see how what we perceive as the physical, what we perceive as each other, right? The corporeal, the body of somebody is secondary, right? That's the emphasis of what we're trying to say here, is that we're shifting our perspective to say that while we live in a world that tells us that what you see is what you get, and if you see somebody's physical body, that's who they are, the shifting our perspective, the same way we re-identified ourselves to say that my essence is divine, so we extend that outwards and we see the divinity within everybody, and that becomes the basis for how we love each other, right? We love each other not because we're told to, not because of ulterior motives, or because it's conducive to effective community building or anything like that, but we love each other because we are intrinsically connected. There is, in some ways we can think of it that, in Kabbalah, this world, the physical world, is referred to as Amr de Chakra, the world of lies. And part of the lies of this world is that the fragmentation is the baseline, right? That we perceive this world, we're born into a world that is a world of separation, and we take separation as the status quo. And we can all sit around a table, and essentially we're 4 souls and 4 bodies, and we see 4 bodies, but really we should see 4 souls. And when we look at 4 souls, it's actually 1 soul, right? There's something that unifies all of us together. If every soul is a piece of God, is a piece of the divine, we know God is one. God can't be separated. So that means our divine souls are also in some way intrinsically connected. And we feel, each one of us feels distinct, feels separated, and that's a fallacy of this physical world, right? So this chapter is really going to speak to that and speak to how we can shift that perspective and learn how to be more aligned. So he says in the Hebrew on the first line, "Mine alidei kiyum advarim hanizkarim le'el, in liyes gufei nivzeh v'nimas be'einav rak simchas etiyah simchas hanefesh levada." In order to integrate everything that we've just said, everything that we just said is that which is on this. Obviously, there's much more to it, but a brief synopsis of it is this supplementary page is titled 31, right? The ways in which we talk to ourselves and we see past our limitations. We see that our essence is divine, and being that we have a divine essence, that means that we're here for a purpose, and we're here integrated with a mission, right? That's part and parcel of what it means to be created, of having a soul come down into a body, is that it's not just for naught, right? God doesn't do anything for nothing, but everything that God does is with a purpose and with a mission in mind. So each one of us living here in this world, having our 70, 80, 120 years on this planet is de facto with a mission, with a purpose baked in. So with all that, a person can learn how to liyes gufa nivzeh v'nimas be'einav. A person can learn how to see past his physical form. And therefore, any joy that we have doesn't come from a piece of cheesecake, right? It doesn't come from anything physical, but our joy comes from the divine. Our joy comes from connecting to God, connecting to each other, and connecting to God. In the joy that we have connecting to God, this also helps us understand the direct and easy path. To learn how to love every person like ourselves, regardless of spiritual stature, right? Because at ultimately what we're focusing on, being that we are recognizing the divine within each person, the spiritual stature becomes ancillary, becomes secondary to the essence, which is that we're focusing on the soul. It's not how it necessarily expresses itself. And in fact, the entire second part of this chapter is all about what do we do, being that we are committing ourselves to seeing the spiritual or prioritizing our sense of spirituality, prioritizing the divine, prioritizing that I'm going to choose to see the essential positivity within you, which is divine. So if that's the case, so how do I then navigate when I witness somebody who's not living up to that, who's living misaligned from that, right? A person who's actively neglecting his spiritual existence, his spiritual essence. How do I deal with that? So that's the second half of this chapter that we're going to get to. But so he starts off. This is the direct and easy path. Ki ma'achar, the third Hebrew line. Ki ma'achar shegufay nimas u'metu of etzlei va'nefesh va'ruach. Mi yedei gdulosan u'maylosan b'sharshan u'mekaran b'elikim chaim. I forgot to mention that the bold text is the literal translation of the Tanya, and the non-bolded text is the notes and where Rabbi Weinberg filled in. So since a person can see past his physical form, and when it comes to the soul, the Alter Rebbe says, who can know their greatness and their excellence, b'sharshanum karan, and their source and their root, the living God, right? So there's no room for a conversation about superiority or any type of hierarchy, right? Nobody knows. We don't live in a reality in which we have any sense or any understanding of spiritual levels. But fundamentally, levels and a hierarchy doesn't apply to the spiritual truths. That is, the divine soul is a piece of God. So it's a false approximation, right? It's not relevant to the conversation. The point is that we're seeing past the physical and we're focusing on the spiritual, which is totally equalizing, which is totally leveling in each person being connected. Because they're all equal, and we all share one source, right? We all share one spiritual source, and that is within God Almighty, within the divine, within the infinite, within the singular infinite, which is God's essence. Nikru Kol Yisrael, and therefore all Jews are called, all of Israel is called brothers, mamish, not just poetically speaking, but in fact literally, mitzad sharash nafsham b'avaya echad, in the fact that all souls are rooted in God's singularity, in God's unity. So therefore, sharing one source makes us all siblings. Raksha hagufim mechulakim. On the top of the second page, it's just that our bodies are separated. Right? We live in a reality in which we can choose to prioritize the physical presentation and see our bodies as defining us, and lean into that distinction, lean into that separation. Or we can choose to see past, and we can choose to reorient our perspective, and we can choose to instead emphasize and operate from a place where we're all one, where it's godly, where everything is godly, where everything is divine and intrinsically connected. This is ultimately the secret of love. Right? He says in the note here, this explains how it is at all possible to demand that one love his fellow as he loves himself. Self-love is innate, natural to man. Love for one's fellow is not. How can a generated love match a natural one? This is readily understood. A Jew not need to create love for one another. Love is an inborn characteristic of his soul on account of its root in godliness, which is common to all souls. It is as natural as the love between brothers, right? It's programmed because it's not a love that is outside of us. Our capacity to love each other is not outside of us. Our capacity to love is baked into the essence of our being because we're all sourced in this singularity. And therefore those who prioritize their physical existence, who see their spirituality as merely ancillary, they can't ever, there's a fundamental blockage to love. right? As long as it is Ella hatluya b'davar levado, right? The Mishnah tells us, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos in the Ethics of the Father says that there's two types of loves: that which is dependent upon something, and that which is not dependent upon something. There's love for the sake of love, and there's love for the sake of something else. And it says that the love that is dependent upon something is not real love, because when that thing ends, when that thing ceases to exist, the love is no longer there. Right? If a relationship is based on something, right, something being done, or a certain attribute that a person presents or that a person brings to the table, when that attribute ceases to be, or when that thing is no longer done, the relationship doesn't have legs to stand on. Whereas love for the sake of love that comes from a place of recognizing singularity, of being oriented towards spirituality, being oriented towards godliness, that's love that is beyond the limitations of time and space. It's not confined to a linear reality, so it can exist forever. And continuing on the third page, V'zau she'amar Hillel hazaken al kiyum mitzvah zu, zau kol hatarakula v'idach perushahi. This is the story. This is what Hillel the elder said. The story goes that a prospective convert came to Hillel and asked him to tell him the entire Torah on one foot, and he said that he referred to this mitzvah, though he referred to it in the negative sense of that which is hateful to you shouldn't do to others, but it is understood as an extension of this mitzvah of loving our fellow. And he said, Zau kol Torah kula, this is all the Torah, this is the entire Torah, the rest is but commentary. And we know as well that in the Midrash it says that Rabbi Akiva, who is in some ways the father of the entire rabbinic tradition, Rabbi Akiva called V'ahavta l'reacha kamecha, the commandment to love our fellow as ourselves. Rabbi Akiva called it Klal Gadol b'Torah, the greatest mitzvah, the greatest principle of the Torah, upon which we can see everything else, or under which we can see everything else, through which we can see everything else.
I've always liked the words that follow, the rest is but commentary. I think that's vital.
Yeah.
Go and learn it.
Right.
Don't regard it as just commentary.
Right.
It's where the meat is.
Right. Right. You can't. It's not enough to just say. It's not enough to just say, okay, well, this is all I have to do, and this is right. It's still. It's a foundation. It's a springboard, but it motivates further study, further exploration.
Yes.
And I think that when we what comes out from having a conversation like this is that this is really, in a lot of ways, the synthesis. This is the ultimate litmus test of if we've done the Aveda, if we've done the work, right? The entire Tanya is speaking to our own personal experience, right? That we're trying to develop more of a relationship with God. We're trying to integrate spiritual practices in a way that changes our physical day-to-day life, right? We're trying to meditate more to make God more real for ourselves. That should affect how we conduct ourselves with food, with relationships, with interpersonal relationships, with how we study, with how we daven, right? All these different elements. That's the program of Tanya, right? But then what it really comes down to is this chapter. In as much as we might daven better, and God might be more real for us when we're feeling good and when we're on a full stomach, if it's when we get cut off in traffic and we haven't eaten all day that this starts to really show that where it really matters, where it's brass tacks. And this is where we can really shift our perspective, that it ceases to become a mere spiritual endeavor, but it becomes integrated, it becomes aligned to how do we actually treat people differently? How do we bring more dignity and more love to our interpersonal relationships? So let's continue. Let's see what he says. Ki yisayid, the second line. Ki yisayid v'sharash kol haTorah, ulagbia ulahales nefesh al guf maila maila ad ikra v'sharsha d'chol almin. Because in fact, the entire purpose of the Torah, if you wanted to say what is Judaism, right? How can Hillel say that this is kol haTorah kula? Is it just that we're trying to be nice to each other? Is this just a golden rule type of deal, lahavdil? Or is there something deeper here? Is there something more essential? Is he speaking to something more essential? He's saying that the entire purpose of what Judaism comes to tell us, is that there are two veins in what we're trying to do here. The first is la'agbil ales hanefesh al guf, is to elevate and exalt the soul high above the body. Right? We come down into this world, and we mentioned this last week, that we're born with a animal soul, with a natural orientation, with a naturalist inclination, right? Self-preservation and self-sustenance and all of that, self-oriented. That is the nefesh bahamis, that is the animal soul. And then it's a process that becomes realized at bar and bas mitzvah or later. That's usually the last part of it, but right, chapter 2 started nefesh hashenis, right? The second soul in Israel is a chelik elikam imamash, that there's some sort of linearity to it, that the godly soul is sort of realized later in life. And it's because we have to be programmed, the way in which the system is set up is that we have to be programmed to this physical world to really be inculcated with that reality for a godly soul to come in, to have a place to take hold, and to then be able to elevate, right? We think everything that we talk about is in the dichotomy of material versus spiritual, right? We're always breaking it down to the physical and the spiritual and the physical. And ultimately, they're two sides of the same coin, or at least they're both limited in some way, right? The physical has real physical limitations, but even the spiritual has limitations, in that neither of them are truly infinite, because the only thing that is truly infinite is God. And for God, the spiritual and the physical are both creations, they're both limitations, they're both modalities. And both of them are containers for both express different elements of Him, both sort of speak to different parts of His reality, of His essence. But neither one is necessarily higher than the other. And so there is, on the one hand, there is the purpose of Judaism. What we are tasked to do is to elevate the soul over the body, is to search after and to chase after the spiritual, right? To elevate and to focus on the spiritual over our physical, recognizing that our baseline is physical, and that to transcend those limitations, to break free of that Egypt, is to broaden our perspective, to live a little more spiritually. But then at the same time, the next line, "V'gam lahamshach harantzaf baruch hu b'chnas Yisrael, k'mishis bar lakaman, dahainu b'makar nishmas kol Yisrael l'mahaveh echad ba'echad." But is also, can I trouble you again?
Sure.
I'm sorry.
I didn't know I had a bell.
I should really prop the door open or something.
I've been invited to the bell now.
Yeah. So it is at the same time, in as much as it is to elevate our perspective, to orient towards something more spiritual, it is also at the same time v'gam lahamshach harantzaf baruch hu b'chnas Yisrael, to draw down the infinite light of the Ein Sof, the infinite light of God Almighty, down into the community, down into this physical world. Right? Both of these are our endeavors. right? We are elevating our perspective. Here. We are elevating our consciousness, and we are also to in some ways be higher than the world, right? That to not be so affected by the world as a mitzias, as an entity unto itself, right? That we're not so that what the world presents is not the be all and end all. It's not a what you see is what you get. We know that we're living on a more spiritual reality, that there is a unifying force that is divine providence, that is God Almighty, that is just underneath the surface, right? And that the physical is not the entirety of the equation. So that's elevating our soul over our body. That's living a more soulful existence. And there's also drawing down godliness into the physical, right? Into our community and into ultimately to all physical things. To not only that we should be able to see the world and not be affected by the world, not be affected by what the world tells us is going on and what the world tells us is, the way it is, but also that we can actually change the world around us and bring more spirituality, bring more godliness into the physical. That's the second vein of what the Torah is about, that Hillel is referring to say that this is the entire Torah and everything else is commentary. V'loik sheyesh pirid chas v'shalom b'neshamas, d'kushabrichu u'leisharia b'sar pogim. And this can't happen when there is fragmentation amongst the souls, when there is fragmentation amongst the people. When people live in a reality, when people are motivated, or at least they're oriented towards the physical, and they're told, and they echo, and they further express that we're all different and that we're all distinct from one another, and that we're each self-defined and self-oriented, and that it's a dog-eat-dog world, right, and it's survival of the fittest, right? That world is not a world that is conducive to bringing godliness into, right? That's not a world that can sustain divinity, because it's a world that's totally self-oriented. It's 8 billion self-orientations, right? Like we say in davening, we say in the Amidah, and the high point of the prayers is the Shemona Esrei, is the silent meditation, and the last blessing of it, which we're told is the container for all blessings, is the blessing of peace. It begins with the word Sim Shalom, bestow peace. The Mishnah tells us that peace is the ultimate vessel for blessing. Right? Peace is our capacity to be together and to sow harmony, to develop harmonious existence, and that the Mishnah tells us is the ultimate vessel for blessing. And so we close out our davening. The last blessing that we make is a blessing for peace, and in that we say, bestow peace, and we say, Barchenu Avinu, bless us, our Father. Right, as we mentioned before, Av Echad L'Kulanu, we all share one source. We share one Father. Barchenu Avinu, bless us, our Father. Kulanu Ka'echad, all of us as one. Ba'ar Panecha, in the light of your countenance, in the light of your face. Meaning to say that it is only when Kulanu Ka'echad Ba'ar Panecha, only when we are all as one can there be the light of your face. That us being harmonious, us being unified, us being united is the facilitator for there to be Or Panecha, the light of your face, this expression of godliness that can come down as peace. Okay, so that's the first part. That's the first part of the chapter. That speaks to the essence of what it means to love, right? So if we were to, especially since it's getting a little late, if we were to summarize this, I think fundamentally the essence is that the material self, right, the physical, the the orientation we have when we say I, right, which includes our physical body as well as our ego, as well as our sense of self, not necessarily a physical thing, but still something that is conducive to separation, that is conducive to discord and to fragmentation. So any part of identifying with that is becomes a hindrance towards love, right? The love is the result of the meditation. The meditation is the tool that is the battle that is Aveda, right? Aveda is this term for the work that we do to inculcate ourselves with divine conscientiousness, with a sense of godliness. And the meditation is the tool that we have to do that work. And the work, the battle of it, is not a battle that is one of that we're morose about or that we're contrite about. It's a battle of joy. It has to be a battle of joy because joy is an activator. Joy pushes us towards action. So it has to always be a battle of joy, yet it is a constant battle, right? It's a consistent battle, right? It's dealing with and confronting our sense of self. That I, that is so pernicious, is something that we engage with daily and moment to moment.
One could read this as sort of an all or nothing, like until we get this right, we're not going to get the Ein Sof penetrating.
Yeah.
But I like to think of it, unless I'm wrong, that it's a pro rata thing, that to the extent that it's realized there's commensurate infusion.
Yeah.
But it's not all or nothing.
I would, so, can it be both? I think that there is some duality to it. That either if we focus on ourselves, there's no room for God. And in that sense, it's sort of black and white. When it comes to when we're in it and we engage and we go through our day of having moments where we're dialed in and moments where we're less dialed in, moments where we're connected and moments where it's all God all the time and moments where it's less so. So in that sense, it's sort of a sliding scale, it's sort of a spectrum that the more we put out, the more connected we are to orienting towards the spiritual, towards the singular, then the more harmonious the world we live in is, each one of us independently. But there is a sort of a baseline, 0 or 1 type of zero-sum deal. Does that make sense?
Yeah. At the very low level of practicing this, it's 0.
Right.
So this isn't just talking about the Messianic era.
Right. This is even now.
Okay.
What was I wanted to add something else. What was I going to add? So the Aveda, the work that we do, this meditation that we do, the fact that it has to be done with joy becomes the impetus for us to be able to feel love, right? It is, that's what it is. What can come out of this joy and this meditation is that there is a way in which we can lose ourselves for a moment or for an hour or for a day. And we can put ourselves aside, we can suspend our own sense of self and go be of service, right? We can, take an hour off of work and go to a soup kitchen. But fundamentally, in that type of service, in that type of mindset, it's always going to be temporary and it's always going to be fleeting. The way in which the boundaries of time and space are such that if that's the reality that we're operating from, it's always going to be fundamentally limited. And what we're emphasizing instead in identifying meditation as the tool that we have for this battle, for learning how to shift our perspective and really inculcate a sense of godliness, is that goes back to what we mentioned last week about the long short way. We brought this story. The Talmud tells us that the rabbi Yeshua ben Hanania says that once I was walking and there was a boy who got the best of me, right? And he asked him for directions at a fork in the road. And first he said, do you want the short, long way or the long, short way? And he said, I want the short, long way, thinking that the first was primary. And it sent him through an unpaved or an untrodden path to the wall of the city. And he came back and he ended up taking the long, short way, which was much longer in mileage, right? But it was a well-trodden path, and it took him right to the center of town. And that the Alter Rebbe uses as the paradigm for what the Chabad system, what the program of Tanya is about, to say that while there are no shortcuts, while it takes a lot of hard work and it takes a lot of consistent, repeated work, ultimately what is realized is short. It's easy to turn on, it's easy to turn over, right? The transformation that ensues comes quick because of all the effort that we put into it. And the change is everlasting, or has the capability to be everlasting. And so the meditation that we do, the meditation that is, these ideas from chapter 31 of learning how to speak to ourselves to say, my core, my essential being is this divine essence, and learning how to reflect that outwards to extend that consideration to everybody else as well, to choose to live in a reality of harmony, a reality that is synergized, that is singular because it is all God all the time. So that meditation takes a lot of work, right? And it's a long process to do that regularly, to do that consistently, and to make any type of headway in really moving the needle on it. But once the needle's moved, it's moved. And when it's moved, living in that reality is short, it's instantaneous to be dialed into that. To be operating on that higher strata is the connection is there, is intrinsic, or is intrinsically accessible.
I have to run.
Sure. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
So, being that it's a little late, we'll try to go through this sort of on the quicker side, the second half of the chapter, which I think is important to emphasize that it can be hard for us and to be in this, to embrace what is so radical about this love, and what is so compelling about living in this reality that is totally spiritual, or at least that is primarily spiritual, is that it can be hard to navigate and to sustain two experiences simultaneously, right? To operate from a place where I see the divine, I see the singular soul within a person, and yet I'm really bothered by the fact that they're not living to that reality, right? Their actions are contradicting that. So how do I navigate that? So this is what the Alter Rebbe is going to address. The last Hebrew line on the second page, or third page, I suppose. Umashikosa b'gmara mishureya shemishure b'chaver shechot hamitzvah lisneisei v'gam lemer l'rabbi sheisneu hainu b'chaver b'torah mitzvahs. So the first is, we have a tradition in that the Talmud tells us that if we see somebody who is missing the mark, if we see somebody who is actively neglecting his spiritual practice, somebody who is doing things to undermine his relationship with God Almighty. So we have the Talmud tells us that we're supposed to hate him, and we're supposed to tell other people that they should also hate him, right? Meaning that we should distance ourselves, and we shouldn't engage with a person like that, a person who is wittingly and voluntarily doing things to undermine and to neglect their relationship with God Almighty. So Alter Rebbe says, first off, not so fast, let's not get carried away with this. This is bechavere, this is when a person is actually your friend, right? Bechavere, not just your friend, but b'Torah and mitzvahs, that it has to be that there is a sense of equality there in Torah and mitzvahs, right? That there is such a freestanding relationship there, that there's a real sense of equality, there's a real sense of having gone through the trenches together or of being in it together. There's a sense that you come from a similar spiritual path, a similar school of thought, a similar orientation to how you integrate this type of practice into your day-to-day life, right? So there can't be any type of hierarchy, there can't be any type of, we have to watch out for the I when it comes to something like this, right? And not only are you on the same page, not only did you go through the trenches together, do you have some type of real fondness for one another and a real close relationship with each other. You've also already done what the Torah says, that you shall repeatedly rebuke your friend. Right? The Torah tells us that when we see somebody who's doing something not right, who's doing something that is negative or that undermines their relationship, that we have to go out of our way to express to them with finding the proper way to articulate it. But we have to find a way to articulate that this is something that contradicts our relationship with God. This is something that a person shouldn't be invested in. Right? We have to find a way to say that what you're doing is really can be really detrimental, and say that without judgment, and say that with care and with compassion. Right? Not from a place of hierarchy, not from a place of elevating myself over the other person, but saying it from a place of empathy and from a place of wanting the best, because it's predicated on this sense of spirituality, this sense of singularity, that we're all in this together, that we're all intrinsically connected. So when the Torah tells us that you should rebuke your friend repeatedly, the Talmud, the word that's used is amitacho, which means it's a word to say your fellow, your comrade, right? Your buddy. And the Talmud points out that it means she'im am she'itacho, that who is on par with you in Torah and mitzvahs. Am she'itacha b'Torah and mitzvahs v'afal pikein lo yishav mechatei v'yishkosav b'sefer charedim. So a person who's at the same level as you, and we know how nuanced that can be, right? We know how that might be, that takes real sensitivity to see a person for who they are, and to be that close with them that you can make such a judgment call to say we're all on the same level, right? It's easy to paint it with broad strokes and just make assumptions, but to actually know that, like the way the Torah is telling us, requires a real intimacy there, requires a real relationship to actually have that foundation. But let's say that is the case, right? So at this point, there's no need to exaggerate the gravity of the sin. It is clearly a deliberate transgression. So we're painting this maybe hypothetical, maybe real situation to say that there's a person who we see, who we have this close relationship with, who we have a real care and consideration for, who is somebody who is our peer, somebody who's our fellow, somebody with whom we have history, and yet at the same time we see them actively doing something, trying to negate, trying to undermine, trying to to destroy their relationship with God Almighty. Right? That's the scene that's set. So in that sense, there is some room to say that there's a mitzvah to distance yourself from a person like that. After all the effort that we've put into it, right? Because we're motivated from a place of love, we're motivated from a place of compassion, and from recognizing that we share this spiritual source, we share this divine singularity that is our soul's intrinsic connection. So with all that, after we've put in the work and we've tried to really be there for our friend, for our fellow, if there's nothing else, there is this Talmudic principle that says that we have to distance ourselves, we have to hate them. However, halfway down the page, but if you're not somebody who's close with this person, if you don't have this deep relationship, if you don't see the person for who they are and know deeply to your core the ways in which you're the same, the ways in which you're on the same footing, you don't see the person in all of their challenges, right? And it's a big question. I'm not sure we can ever see a person for all of their challenges. But let's say that we can, right? Nor is he on intimate terms with him. So at that point, there's no room to say that we have an obligation to hate him. We're not even allowed the opportunity to consider such a thing, right? We have to kill them with kindness. We have to exude love, and we have to double down on the love. About this, Hillel HaZaken, the same Hillel HaZaken who said that the entire Torah is about elevating ourselves, elevating our consciousness to the spiritual level, and to draw down godliness into this physical world, all through the practice of exuding love, of loving our fellow as ourselves. So Hillel said, "Havim et talmidav shel Aaron, ohev shalom, ohev es habrius, and mekarven l'Torah." Hillel had another principle which said that we should always strive to emulate Aaron the Kohen, right? Aaron the Kohen, who was Moses' brother, Aaron the Kohen, who was the tremendous lover of the Jewish people. It is said about him, the qualities that Hillel saw in Aaron HaKohen were that he was Oyev Shalom, he loved peace, V'Raidav Shalom, and he pursued peace, which we're told meant that not only did he love to try to help people make up and to get past their differences, but that he would go out of his way to find creative methods to solve disagreements. Oyev es habrius, he loved all creatures, u'mekarven l'Torah, and he brought them all to the Torah. Loimar, she'afa rechekim m'Torah Hashem v'avidasei lochen nikrim shem bris ba'alma tzarich l'mashchan b'chevle avesis ava. That even those who we perceive who could just be called creatures, meaning to say that they have no redeeming qualities except for the fact that God created them and they're here on this earth, right? We are, and that doesn't mean that they don't have other redeeming qualities, but maybe we just don't see any other redeeming qualities. We only see them as nothing other than something that God created. Those we must attract with strong cords of love. We have to exude and connect to them with love and with compassion. And maybe through this we can bring them to a recognition, to a relationship with God Almighty. And even if one fails in this, he has not forfeited the mitzvah of neighborly love. Right? That there are two elements here. There's trying to help the person and trying to get them to see that the relationship with God surpasses all and is more important than whatever else they're involved in, and trying to help inculcate that conscientiousness. And there's also the mitzvah of loving them. And those two can exist side by side. And just because we're not necessarily able to help the person doesn't mean that we don't have to love them. And even for those who were saying, like we said before, that a person that we can really claim this equality with, we can really claim this claim to know this person who, even after we told them and we expressed to them that what they're doing undermines their relationship with God, and expressed it in a way of compassion and of consideration, and it was still neglected to the point that there is maybe a mitzvah to hate them, there is still at the same time a mitzvah to love them. And they don't contradict each other, and they don't negate one another. And Alter Rebbe says, Shtein hen emes, that we can experience both simultaneously, we can express both simultaneously. Sinna mitzad rasha b'hem, we can hate the evil, we can hate the bad, we can hate the negative, we can hate that which is misaligned, that is detracting from their core, from their essence. And we can love the good, we can love that spiritual, that singular essence that is the divine soul, that is the spark of God Almighty. Which is the divine spark, which is inside of them, which sustains, which vitalizes, which animates their divine essence. And with that we have to be compassionate. Because in recognizing, in being able to see the divine core within every person, it requires us to be tremendously compassionate, to see that some people aren't connected to that. Some people don't live with that as a day-to-day reality. Some people don't live with the consciousness that they have a divine spark inside of them. And they don't operate, their actions don't reflect that either. And they can sometimes live a very difficult existence and a very hard life because they're not living with that spiritual reality. And we're not here to judge, and we're not here to cast aspersions or to look down on anybody. But when we see something stark, when we see something apparent, we have to be compassionate, not to alienate them or to distance them by looking down our nose, but we have to act with compassion and consideration to always recognize that that divine essence is deep down inside and is crying to come out, is working to be elevated, to be seen, to be realized. But Achmanis mevatalas asina, and this compassion cancels out. It banishes hatred, umereres ha'ava, and it arouses love. Right? This is what our experience is when we're compassionate. There's no ability for us to experience any type of hate. It only pushes us towards love. Like it says about the verse, Jacob who redeemed Abraham. This is explained further in the note. It's a verse from Isaiah. But Jacob Jacob represents the essence of compassion. Compassion redeems Abraham, which is love, right? Compassion frees love. It liberates love. It facilitates love. It helps us to see past the hate and to rise above any feelings of negativity and to just exude love, just kill them with kindness type of deal. And the Alter Rebbe concludes with a parenthesis in this conversation of hate. That's what we're talking about, hate, and we're saying that even hate doesn't really have place, even though the Talmud has taught us that there might be room for it. Really, when we use compassion as our guiding, as our North Star, we see that there's no room. Compassion negates hate. So he addresses the fact that King David also mentions hate. King David mentions that I hated them with a consummate hatred, King David says. So he brings the Talmud, the teaching from the Talmud, which is that this is referring to heretics and atheists who were actively and being proactive in trying to not only undermine their own relationship with God, but to take down Judaism entirely on a collective level. People who stood in the way of Judaism and were malicious in trying to find ways to destroy it. Those are the people who King David was referring to when he said that he hated them. So in conclusion, the heart of Tanya and the radical love that it teaches us to practice is is just like everything else in the program of Tanya, and I'm sorry that we're going over, but is a lifetime's worth of work. And like everything in Avodah, everything in this work that we talk about, that it goes step by step, it goes with baby steps, right? It doesn't go with radical transformations overnight, but it goes with integrating a little bit of change and a little bit of work every day. And that's the system, that's the long, short way. And that the heart of the matter, the heart of everything is how we relate to each other, the compassion, the love, and the dignity that we bring to our interpersonal relationships. Everything else is in some ways secondary. Our relationship with God is in some ways secondary to our relationship with each other. And that when we go from a soul place, when we go from a place of singularity, we go connecting to each other. There was a conversation amongst the Hasidim of the Alter Rebbe, the followers of the Alter Rebbe who wrote the Tanya, relative or in a greater context of a conversation that was being had amongst many Rebbes throughout Europe at the time, which is what is greater, to love each other or to love God? And the common thought at the time was that loving God is the ultimate. And the Alter Rebbe came along and said loving each other is the ultimate, because by loving each other, you're loving who God is loving. And that's the ultimate expression of being in a relationship, is sharing that passion, is sharing that love. And so when we invest in loving each other and we invest in expressing that love outwards, that it's not just enough that it's a feeling, but that it has to translate into thought, speech, and action. It has to be expressed in a physical form in this world. When we do that, we bring the harmony to each other, and we allow each other and we allow ourselves to have a fuller relationship with God and a fuller spiritual realization. So thank you everybody for coming. And there's a lot for us to think about, there's a lot for us to reflect on. And we'll see everybody next week, God willing. Before I turn this off, just so everybody's on the same page, I was made aware that what is supposed to be our last class is on Tisha B'Av. So we won't, that's on the July 27th, I think. So we won't have that class. So either we will, July 27th is meant to be our last class. So we have a lot of time till then to figure out what we can do instead. Maybe we can move it to Tuesday. Maybe we could just forget it. Maybe we could do it a different time. Maybe we can hold it off till the next week. We can sort of figure out what will work instead. But just be aware that Thursday, July 27th, we're not going to have class.
I thought actually that the class was until 9. You say it went over, but it says.
Oh, really? It says till 9?
7:30 to 9, just so. I mean, don't feel like you went over.
I have a question. So the love your neighbor as yourself kind of concept is not anything recent. It's in the Tanya. So
it's in the Torah.
Torah, yes, it's in Torah, in the Kiddushim, in Leviticus, and then like in Tanya, it's like explained more.
Yeah.
And what if someone later comes along and say, this is like love your neighbor as yourself. That's the main thing. Nothing else matters but this. At the end of the day, if you don't do a positive action towards loving your neighbor, same as yourself, your day is really just not really anything at all. And so someone else challenges him, was like, why? So would that person get the credit of saying, I said it. I said love your neighbor as yourself, and I explained that being the most important command of your day. Would that person be like, oh, I got it from the Tanya. I didn't really invent that concept, or I didn't explain it or interpret it. Like, I don't know, but I just heard, like, do you know Rav Ashlag?
Alshich?
No, Rav Ashlag.
Oh.
Yehuda Ashlag?
Yeah.
So he wrote an essay on this. I
Mhm.
think on this in that portion where, and so someone challenges him was like, why? Well, okay, so if you say this is the most important thing, why isn't throughout the whole Bible God keeps saying, love your neighbor as yourself, love your neighbor as yourself, but there are other things that was mentioned, just a lot of miscellaneous, all kinds of retorts, to-dos. And so Rav Ashok was like, yeah, because the Israelites weren't ready to love their neighbor as themselves, so they have to go through all these kind of other things in order to ultimately get there.
Mm-hmm.
And so is that a new thing? I just don't know, because he claimed that it's him that said that. And so, and like how like every rabbi that comes along later in the sequence of time, they're gonna come up with new things that interpret the Torah and expound on the Tanya and whatever. So is it like, do they have the freedom or the intellectual, like, do they have the IP towards saying, I granted this, I come up with this, I added new light into this, or could we like all accept that into like the whole Jewish canon, just because that person has some sort of credential before?
So everything is like works on a hierarchical system, that what comes before is given more credence, right? Back to the beginning of time, that the earlier generations all have more legitimacy and more gravity to what they say, and so everything is in some ways a permutation of that which we received from the generations before us. There's a story of the Mechaber who wrote the Shulchan Aruch, of Yosef Karo, that he was working on a concept in halacha for weeks and months and couldn't figure it out, and then finally figured it out, and it was like a real breakthrough for him. And that same day in the afternoon, he was walking through the streets and he heard two teenagers studying Talmud, and one asked the other one the same question, and the other one knew it right away. And he was like very discouraged from the fact that he spent months trying to figure this out, and this kid just knew it straight away. And he happened to have a chavrusa, a study partner with an angel. He was that type of guy. And the angel told him that he brought it into the world. He brought that whole rationale into the world, and once it was in the world, then anybody could it was accessible to everybody. So that's how this kid could know it. So when it comes to identifying that this is the entirety of Judaism or the entire purpose of the Torah, it's a broad claim to make. It's a bold claim to make, and I think generally we shy away from identifying anything as the thing, because there's 613 mitzvahs and they're all equally dear in the eyes of Hashem. So we don't, elevate one over any others. That we have Gemaras that do that. We have Mishnahs that do that, and we're good with that. But doing that ourselves, or even in recent generations, is not something we tend to really do. So that could be why he was given a hard time about it. But ultimately, when it comes to credit, if people are doing it for credit, then I think they're missing the point, and there's good reason to be skeptical of whatever they have to say at that point.
Yeah, it's not them that said it, but it's just like anybody that come across, oh, here's someone that published an essay and it got into the hand of one person and no idea about previous knowledge about any of this, and he just read it. He's like, oh, okay, love your neighbor as yourself. That's the most important thing. It's just like a non-Jewish person. They read it and then were curious about Judaism, so they read it and then they were challenged that person. And so apparently, it's, why are you saying this? Like, anyway, maybe it's just like I heard it from someone else also. So it's like a summary of a rabbi who's summarizing this concept from the Torah. So.